All right, welcome to another week in the studies of Gospels of Mark. This week we're going to be looking at Mark chapter 13, often called the Olivet Discourse because it takes place on the Mount of Olives. It is also found in both Matthew and in Luke, although there are some differences. The basic account is the same. It begins with the disciples admiring Herod's temple, and they are impressed with the massive stones and the beautiful building. And Jesus challenges them and warns them and prophesies, in fact, that not one stone would be left on top of each other. And that is indeed what happened. While you can go to Jerusalem and go to the Wailing Wall is not actually part of the temple, but was part of the foundation of the temple. That's all that was left of the temple that was in Jerusalem. And they're admiring the buildings around the temple and the temple itself. Jesus was correcting a misunderstanding, they thought, that this temple facility would remain, but they underestimated the impact of the change that Jesus was bringing, that the end of the temple was at hand. And you could even argue, and it's possible, that Jesus leaving the temple area before he begins this conversation is in fact symbolically important as well. And to go to the Mount of Olives also has significance in the sense that Zechariah predicts that that is where the Messiah would show up on the day of the Lord. So there's some profound kind of connections taking place here. But when they get to the Mount of Olives, Peter, James, John, and Andrew ask Jesus two questions in connection with this. When will it happen that the temple will be destroyed? And what will be the signs that these things are about to be fulfilled? And the main theme in Jesus' answer is undoubtedly to be watchful, to be prepared, to be on guard. He says this over and over again in this discourse. He talks about the fact that false prophets and messiahs are going to come, that there's going to be wars, earthquakes, famines, that all of these things must happen first. Then he moves on in beginning in verse 9, talking about persecution and distress, that for God's people, after he warns that they need to stay on guard, he talks about the fact that there's going to be persecution and that they're going to stand trial, and that the gospel is going to be preached throughout the world, and that they should not worry, but trust that the Spirit will give them words to say when they face opposition. Then he goes on even further to say that believers will be betrayed by even their own family members, and that in some cases they'll even be put to death. And so these are all things that are happening in the future. And then he turns again to another warning, and he says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation, you should flee to the mountains immediately. You're not even supposed to go back into your house. So one of the pictures that Jesus says, if you're on the roof of your house, don't go in and get your things. The houses in Israel at that time would have had outside stairways, so you couldn't access the roof from inside the house. You would access it from an external stairway. And Jesus is saying, just get off your roof and run to the mountains. Don't even go into your house. And so there's just such a sense of a immediate need to leave. And one of the things that we know is that in fact happened when Jerusalem fell, beginning in 68 AD. Well, I guess I think it started in 66, the siege of Jerusalem, but historians believe that the Christians fled Jerusalem in 68, and that was when the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem. In Mark, we're said when you see the abomination that causes desolation, that you should um, flee. And so, this is something that had actually took place historically, and that by the time that the prophecy being fulfilled that the temple would be destroyed utterly, it was indeed a terrible time. People being butchered, starvation, all kinds of terrible things happened in Jerusalem during that time. We're also told that there's going to be many who claim to be the Messiah, and Jesus says, don't listen to them, because there are going to be people who will even try and deceive the believers themselves. And so, again, he says, be on guard. And then he talks about signs in the sky, the sun, moon, and the stars. And in verse 26, he talks about, in contrast to the false messiahs, how he will return. The Son of Man, he is speaking of himself in the third person, and that is a reference to vision in the book of Daniel, that at that time the Messiah, Jesus, will gather together the elect from all over the world, from every tongue, tribe, and nation. And he uses as an example to tell them how soon it is that when you see a fig tree, the twigs become tender, you know that summer is coming soon. And I'm not sure where you live if this is the case, but certainly in Canada, we know when spring's coming, because the plants prepare to bud, and while they're kind of solid during winter, as spring comes, they're about to bud, and that's very similar to what Jesus is saying here. And he's saying that his return is going to be close, right at the door. And he also says that this generation would not pass before these things happen. And as I just mentioned, some of these things have in fact happened, and they did in fact happen in Jesus' generation. But there are quite a number of things that yet need to be fulfilled before Jesus will return. Probably most obvious is that the gospel has not yet been preached to every tribe, tongue, and nation. So this has been a challenge for people as they seek to understand this passage. How can Jesus say that all these things will happen in this generation? And so it's been there's been different answers to this. Some say that Jesus was talking just about the fall of Jerusalem, which would fit within that category. Um, Others say that Jesus just didn't know. And I think it's good to look at how we've seen other prophecies fulfilled in the Old Testament, because those are the prophecies we had before the time of Christ. And while in hindsight we can see how they're ultimately fulfilled in Jesus, there are also sometimes more than one fulfillment. And I think that's the best explanation for what's going on here. Jesus is talking about the fall of Jerusalem and his return as one event, and it actually has multiple fulfillments. And so when Jesus saw the end of time, when he described it, he described those events together as if they're one. I liken it, and I've heard this expressed to me by one of my professors many years ago, kind of like the experience you have when you come to a mountain range. When you're far away, it looks like a single wall of one large set of mountains. But as you get closer, you see there's other mountains in behind that mountain. And so what you thought was actually one mountain, as you get closer, you can see that there's two, or maybe even three. And so I think that's kind of the way Jesus is describing these events, that the fall of Jerusalem was just a precursor to the end of days, which is yet ahead of us. But I think the other important thing for us to keep in mind is that um, the important aspect that Jesus keeps saying over and over again is to be watchful, to be on guard. We're not to be afraid of these things to come. Jesus is telling us so that we won't be afraid when we experience persecution. And remember, Mark was likely written during a time of persecution when the Christians were being hauled in by the Roman authorities and put on trial. And some of them were being martyred. It could be very distressing to them, but Jesus predicted it. And Mark is relaying that information that he received from Peter, that they should expect persecution. And that really is something that um, is quite amazing, because when you think about it, that was unheard of. Even in the Jewish time, they experienced oppression from the Romans, but the Romans, up to that point, let them be with their religion. And so this was prophetic, and it was not yet clear that that was the case. So Jesus is talking about something that was yet to come very clearly, because this is exactly what happened to the Christians. And it was something new. The Romans had not done that with the Jews. And so Jesus, in speaking this prophecy, was really being very powerful and predictive, but it was meant to give God's people comfort, to know that even though they were going through these persecutions, that they had been foretold, that God knows about it, and that Christ is still to come, and that they can be at peace no matter what challenges, difficulty, or distress they're going through, because God is fulfilling his plan. And the last section of Mark 13 makes it very clear that the idea that Jesus could have been describing something he didn't fully know in his human form, because he chose to limit himself, is seen in this final part of this passage, where he says that no one knows the day or hour, not even the Son himself, but only the Father. And what does he say in response to this? Once again, he says, therefore, be on guard, be alert. He says it twice. He then gives another picture, and it's about a servant whose master goes away. What is a servant to do? The servant is to watch by the door. No matter when he may come, we're supposed to watch. And this is significant because the discourse on the Mount of Olives begins and ends with that same admonition to watch. And so, really, if we take this discourse as a whole, it is given in order that the disciples might have peace in the midst of trials and tribulations. One of the greatest trials early on they experienced was, in fact, the fall of Jerusalem. And Jesus predicted it, and it appears that the Christians, because Jesus predicted this, were able to flee to safety in the mountains, just as Jesus had said. And so we take that as a template for how we are to move forward as believers in this present time while we still await his coming. And that is not to be worried about what we will say if we face persecution, but to trust in the Holy Spirit, to trust that even though plagues and famines and wars and rumors of wars and difficulties and challenges face us, that all this is part of the birth pangs of the Messiah, and that we can trust and know that Jesus will return and come for his people. And so this is a very lengthy, it's the longest single uh, single session of teaching in the entire Gospel of Mark, and it concerns the final things. And its timing is also significant because we are approaching Jesus' last days with his disciples, and soon he will be arrested. And so he is warning them ahead of time to be prepared and to know that God is in charge even in the midst of these difficulties. All right, that's it for this week. See you next week.